So when I first conceived of doing this evening, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly what topic I wanted to cover, and I eventually came up with the idea of doing low points because I thought it was something that could be interpreted in so many different ways, and we could get so many fantastic stories, and we really have up here tonight. And at some point I realized that that meant that I would have to tell a story of my low point. And I started thinking about what that meant to me, and specifically what separated a low point from some of the worst moments in my life, things like watching my father die of lung cancer, or the time I lost everything I owned in an apartment flood with no insurance, or the time I got fired from my job at Blockbuster Video as a manager when the district manager accused me of stealing $600 from the till over the 6 months I'd worked there. And that last one was particularly bad for me because, and this is 100% true, ever since I was a young kid, I've had a horrible irrational fear that someday I would go to prison for a crime I didn't commit. I think it comes from growing up watching the A-Team and believing that going to prison for crimes you didn't commit was just something that happened to people. But I thought about it for a while and realized that all these things, as terrible as they were things that kind of happened to me. They were acts of nature, or acts of God, or capricious managers. But they were all things that were out of my control. And I realized for me a low point had to be something that I had a direct hand in. It had to be something that I brought onto myself through really poor decision making. And not just that poor decision making where you do the wrong thing because you think it's the right thing at the time and only later do you realize you did something really stupid. But that poor decision making where you realize at the time you're doing something really stupid, but you go ahead and do it anyways. And I think having an affair with my best friend's fiance would fall into that category. Yeah, I'm not a nice guy in this story. I'm going to get that out there right off the bat. It is 1998, and I am 24 years old, and I had just moved back to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, after a truly disastrous year, spent about an hour and a half away in Boone, North Carolina. A year in which I lost everything I owned in an apartment flood. A year in which just a few days after that I was fired from my job at Blockbuster Video for being falsely accused of theft. And not only had I just lost my job and lost my apartment, but my best friend, who I lived with, a man we'll call Dan for the sake of this story, had just broken up with his fiance of 3 years when he realized he was in love with someone else. And I guess that technically makes her his ex-fiance, which seems like that should make a huge difference, but it really didn't seem all that different to me. So I moved back to Winston-Salem and taken up a job at a coffee shop that was now owned by a friend of mine. I used to work there years ago, and he actually used to work for me, and he'd suddenly married into some money, and instead of quitting his job at the coffee shop, just decided to go ahead and buy the coffee shop because he was now rich enough to burn a wet mule. I came back and I was working for him, and things in my life seemed to be at least getting slightly better. You know, at least I had a job, and I eventually found an apartment actually through a friend of mine. And this is when I ran into Amy. Now, Amy was Dan's very recent ex-fiancée, and she also lived in Winston-Salem. And we started hanging out, and I think primarily we started hanging out because we felt we kind of almost had to prove to someone, I don't know if it was to each other or to ourselves, that we actually were friends. We had been friends for so long, but it had been through this kind of mutual person in the middle that there was that part of me that wanted to, when she got broken up with, and it was very hard on her, to show that I wasn't going to turn my back on her, and that she and I actually had a relationship that was beyond her being with my best friend for so many years. And we started hanging out quite a bit, only for some reason I felt really guilty about it, like I didn't want Dan to know. Not that I necessarily thought he would not approve, but just I felt like I was betraying some trust spending so much time with someone he had just broken up with. And so when we were hanging out together, we were kind of sneaking around. We didn't want it to get out. And there was just something about sneaking around that we started joking that people were going to think we were sleeping together. And that turned into me joking, well, if people are going to think we're sleeping together. And so we started sleeping together. And I realized right away that what we were doing was wrong. It was, there was nothing to our relationship outside of this fact that I was 24 and it was sex. Specifically, it was sex with someone I really wasn't supposed to be having sex with. Taboo, forbidden sex. As it turns out, taboo, forbidden sex is pretty much the second best kind of sex there is outside of sex in a long-term committed marriage. Now, as it happened, everything in the story is 100% true. Now, as it happened, at this same time, I was in a very low point, and things were getting better, and I did the only thing I ever knew how to do when I was depressed and needed to kind of start feeling better, and that is I got involved in theater. It's kind of always been the bomb for me. And so a good friend of mine and I decided to do a production of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead in the Park, in which I was playing Rosencrantz, or possibly Guildenstern. and this was really exciting. We were in our 20s and we thought we were really cool. We thought we were like Steppenwolf. We thought we were doing something absolutely amazing. We were making our own costumes out of things we got at the Salvation Army by turning pants inside out and cutting them off the knees and putting rubber bands on them so they look like balloon pants. And somehow we convinced the local paper to come out and do an article on this production we were doing in the park, and it was a big article. It was a Sunday newspaper and had a big full-color photograph in the middle with our names underneath it in a big long article, and I was really excited about this. And at the time I was very poor. I hadn't even gotten my first paycheck since moving back, and I was basically living off the tip money I was getting every day. And the newspaper came out and Amy came, and we decided to go get a copy of the paper, but before I could leave, my phone rang. And it was my mother, and she had heard about the article in the paper, and she wanted a copy of the paper, and of course, I needed to send one to my grandmother. And if I was going to send one to my grandmother, I had to send one to my Uncle Nick, or my Uncle Nick would feel jealous of my grandmother. And then, of course, my sister would want one. And I realized I didn't have enough money for all these papers. This was the Sunday edition. It was like $1.25. I could barely afford the one. So we're driving along and we pass a gas station. And in front of the gas station is one of those newspaper boxes, the kind you put in $1.25 and you open it up and you take just the one on top. And I have this brilliant idea, because the thing I haven't mentioned about my relationship with Amy is basically what we've done so far is our relationship is not based on any kind of love or trust. It's just based on the fact that we're not supposed to be having sex together. And after a while, just the fact that we're not supposed to be doing it isn't enough, and we start challenging each other. We had sex in a public park after close because I challenged her to. And then she challenged me to have sex in a stopped elevator in a hotel. And then one night we somehow ended up having sex against the side of some stranger's Camaro in the parking lot of a Reverend Horton Heat concert. While Big Red Rocket of Love like thundered through the walls. And seriously, if you ever have a chance to do that, do it! So we're driving and we see this newspaper box, and she looks at me and she says, we should steal the papers. We should pay for one. I can feel you looking at me, Rachel. We should pay for one paper, but we should take them all. And our whole relationship had now become this like out of control game of truth or dare, like this sexual game show that neither one of us wanted to back down from. And I wasn't about to lose the game at this point, so I went, hell yeah, we're gonna. So we pull up in front of this gas station, and we notice that there's the gas station, there's the newspaper box. Right next to the gas station is a state patrolman, fast asleep in his car. He's got his feet up on the dashboard and his state patrolman's hat pulled down over his face, and he's just fast asleep. And I say, we should steal the newspapers right in front of the policeman. And she says, hell yeah, we should. But she wasn't about to lose the game either. So she parks the car, and I sneak up, and I put in my $1.50, and I open it, and I take the big stack of newspaper, and she thought it'd be really funny to pull away a little bit and stop, and then pull a little away and stop, and I'm running after her. Sleep right there, and I finally catch up with her, and I get in, and we pull away, and I'm just on fire. Like, I'm just, adrenaline's pumping, and this is the most awesome thing I've ever done in my life. And we're like Bonnie and Clyde, and we're going down there like Smokey the Bandit, and whatever Sally Field's name was. We're pulling away, and I'm on top of the world for about a minute and a half until we see the lights behind us. And what I didn't take into consideration is while the state trooper may have been asleep in his car, the guy working in the gas station was not. And it's really not that hard to walk around and wake up a state trooper. So he pulls us over, we pull to the side of the road. And I know I'm in trouble immediately because he doesn't go to the driver's side like you normally do at a traffic stop. He immediately comes over to the passenger side where I'm sitting. And I roll down the window and he looks at me. And then he looks in the back seat at the huge stack of stolen newspapers. And then he looks at me again. And he says, "Son, did you steal those newspapers?" And luckily, I was a real quick thinker, and I said, "Yep." Because I was an idiot when I was 24 years old. And I didn't think I was in any serious trouble. And I said, "Yeah," and I kind of explained why I did it as if that would make any difference to him. And he looks at me for a second, and I can see him kind of considering what to do. And finally he says, "Let me see your ID." Now, I didn't have my ID on me. I wasn't driving. I didn't even have my wallet. I don't even know if I had an ID at the time. I was riding my bike everywhere. I have no idea what my driver's license was. And I told him, I said, I don't have my ID on me. He looks at me again, he narrows his eyes and says, "Let me see your ID." And at this point, I may have said something along the lines of, "I don't have identification. I don't believe I need to carry it on me at all times because this isn't a police state." Because I was stupid. And I didn't trust authority because I was in my 20s. And he glares at me and he says one last time, "Son, if you do not show me some identification right now, you are under arrest." So I do the only logical thing I can think of and show him some identification, and that is a full color picture of me in the center of the newspaper. I learned that apparently policemen don't like it when you use stolen evidence as identification in your own defense, and I was immediately arrested and thrown in the back of his patrol car. And in what seemed like less than an hour, I was before the judge. And the judge said to me, and I do remember this part quite clearly, I was explaining what happened, and he had a copy of the newspaper in front of him, one of the stolen ones, and he opened it up to the picture of me, and he looked at it and goes, "That is you." Which I felt somewhat justified in that, and using that as identification. He knows it's me. So I get charged with petty larceny, and I get a fine of $200. And I explained to the judge that I don't have $200. I barely had the $1.50 to steal the newspaper. And I propose what I think is a quite reasonable offer, and I say I can pay $10 a month for the next approximately 2 years. Which he nods at me and goes, "All right, let's go through that door and speak to the bailiff." So I go through the door off just next to the judge's bench, and I walk through, and the bailiff immediately arrests me for a second time, handcuffs me, and throws me in a cell. There are about 4 or 5 other guys in the cell with me, and I'm informed that I will remain in that cell until someone brings my $200 bail. So I think about calling Amy and then realize that's a really bad idea. So I eventually call my sister, and she has no more $200 than I do. I might as well have been asking her to shit gold bricks. But she at least says she'll try. She'll call around. I have a lot of friends still in town, and she'll see what she can do. And so she puts... I'm sitting in there, and they take my shoes, and they take my belt, and most importantly, they take my copy of P.G. Wodehouse's What Ho Jeeves, which really makes me angry because I hate when people take my book away from me. I actually have mild panic attacks when I don't have a book on me. And so I'm sitting in there, and I may have said something along the lines, are you afraid I'll try to read to you and educate you? So I'm sitting in jail with my pants falling down and no shoes and nothing to read, and I'm bored out of my mind. And time is passing. It's 2, 2:30, 3, 3:30, 4. And at 4:30, they come in and they gather the 4 or 5 of us in the cell. And they put our hands behind our backs and they put handcuffs on us. And I asked, what's going on? And they said, we're preparing you for transfer. And I didn't know what that meant. I said, transfer to where? We're already in the jail. Now, as you know, I have a horrible fear of going to prison because of TV. But this is North Carolina, and my perception of what jail is also based entirely on the Andy Griffith Show. So I have a much less great fear of spending the night in jail. I assume there'll be some bars and a little cot, and maybe I'll get a state-issued harmonica. And so I said, I thought this was the jail. And he says, no. Winston-Salem doesn't have a jail. This is the holding cell. If you were not bailed out by 5 p.m., you were moved over to the Forsyth County Prison. And then it dawned on me that I am fucking going to prison. And the only thing worse than going to prison for a crime you didn't commit is going to prison for a really stupid crime you did. Because I don't at least have that righteous indignation of knowing I'm an innocent man. I'm just an idiot. So I'm handcuffed with my hands behind my back, and they lead me into a huge room about half the size of a school gymnasium. Huge, only with bulletproof glass everywhere. And there's about 30 or 40 other guys already in there. And they all have their hands handcuffed behind their backs, and they come over and they unhandcuff one of our arms and then handcuff us to the guy next to us until there's like 30 or 40 of us standing in a line like paper dolls of men just handcuffed one to the other. And we're standing there, and I'm starting to freak out because a bus pulls up and I can see it through the bulletproof glass with the wire in it, and it's a prison bus. It's the kind of bus they put people on to take them to prison. And I have driven past the Forsyth County Prison quite a bit. And it's an honest-to-God prison. Like there's a fence and then some space and then another fence. And like guys in orange jumpsuits like working out. And I am just panicking inside. And I don't know what's happening. And the door opens and a guy comes in with a wheelie cart. And the only things on this wheelie cart were a selection of orange jumpsuits in different sizes, a big metal trash can, and a box of latex gloves. And then I realized now it's time for the cavity search, in case I am holding a switchblade or drugs or a copy of Jeeves and the Offing in my ass. So we're handcuffed, and they start way down the other end of this long chain of people on somewhere almost exactly in the middle. And I make the stupid mistake of making eye contact with the very first guy. And this guy's maybe 6'4", and bald with no neck and tattoos. And he looks like the kind of guy at a central casting for someone going to prison. Like he looks like someone who would fit in very well in prison. And this guy is huge and scary and so much tougher than me. And yet when a hand goes up his ass, he makes this horrible pain face that tells me I am not going to like this at all. And after that, I stopped looking. And I come down the line, and the only person I look to is this guy right next to me, who I swear to God looked just like Gary Coleman. An American kid, about 19 or 20, was maybe 5 feet tall. And he looks at me, and I look at him, and there's this moment of unspoken camaraderie. Like we make eye contact, and there's this moment of like, yeah, we're in this together. And suddenly I just feel like this guy is my best friend, and somehow I find that ever so slightly relieving. Like at least I've got my new best friend with me. And they're coming down the line, and you can tell that they're getting closer and closer because we're all chained together, so the closer they get, the more I have to bend over each time. It's a little like this, and then as they get, like if you've ever seen a big fence and it starts to go at one end. So every couple seconds I stand up and I'm bending over more, and they're getting closer, and I'm starting to really panic inside now, and I'm breathing heavily, and luckily I have the presence of mind to go, for God's sakes, don't start crying. Crying does not make prison better. They don't go easy on you when you start bawling. So they're getting closer and closer, and every once in a while I hear something clink into the metal basket. I don't even want to know what it is, but I'm panicking, and they're getting closer and closer, and they get to finally, they're to the guy just to the left of Gary Coleman. And he and I are looking at each other, and he's sweating, and I'm sweating, and all of a sudden there's a crackle from the speaker above my head, and I hear, Cassavaugh, you've been bailed. Those are the sweetest words I've ever heard in my life. Like seriously, when my absolutely adorable 6-year-old daughter looks at me and says, I love you, Daddy, that is nothing! Compared to Cassavaugh, you've been bailed. Empty, hollow, meaningless thing. And the thing I regret most about that little stint I had in jail, and I didn't even mean to do it, but first of all, when they say my name, I go, that's me! Quickly! The sharks are circling. And I feel really bad about doing this, and I don't mean to, but I look to my new best friend and go, I guess we're not together after all. So they come over, and they take me out of the line, and they chain him to somebody else. And I walk out, and there is my sister. And with my sister is my best friend Dan, who's just driven an hour and a half down from Boone with $200 to bail me out of jail. And the affair ended right there. I had lost the game in the most spectacular way possible. But honestly, not going to prison is a really good consolation prize. And I, apart from a couple phone calls, never saw her again. And I never spoke to her again. And I was just happy to not go to jail. And that was a game I never wanted to play again, because it is one I was not suited for. But there's one thing I've learned after 10 years of happy marriage, and that is I'm actually really good at the home edition.